Hey, Adam, I'm
Okay.
gonna go ahead and
Good
hey, how
afternoon,
are you?
everyone.
I'm gonna go ahead
Thank you
and
for
say that
joining
it's
us
great to
and
meet
welcome
you
to
too,
today's
Adam.
today's webinar. This webinar is titled Pascua Yaqui, a case study and comprehensive planning and managing multiple projects at the same time. On behalf of the Native Learning Center, I'd like to welcome you all today. My name is Hervins Monesteem. I am the Training and Development Manager here at the Native Learning Center, and I will be today's facilitator. Disclaimer, the webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The materials discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. How to interact with today's webinar. If you'd like to ask a question, you can simply use the hand tool on the top right section of your screen, and you can interact with us that way if you have a question, or you're more than welcome to place a comment or question in the chat. Today, we have the presentation. It's available in PDF version for you to download, as well as today we also, pardon me for that, today we also have a post-webinar survey that we're gonna kindly ask you all to fill out for us. This helps us with all of the initiatives we have here at the Native Learning Center and helps us improve our trainings and future webinars that we have. As mentioned before, we do have the chat box located on the right of your screen. If you have a question or comment, you can interact with us there. Okay, today I have the pleasure of introducing today's presenter, Mr. Adam Rose. He is the Director of Partnerships and Growth at Trovoa. He's joined with his colleagues, Gerard Jesse, Mr. Keith Gregory, as well as Mr. Rolando Jaimes, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So today, Adam will be discussing his experience, well, the Pascua Yaqui tribe's experience with the low-income housing tax credit, affordable housing program, grant Title VI, Capital Magnet Fund, to develop how they used those funds to develop a portfolio of 10 projects and 300 plus housing units. So without further ado, Adam, I'll let you take over control.
All right. Thanks so much, Hervins, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen here. Just 1 second.
Yeah, Adam, are you able to control those slides? If not, I'll just.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Okay.
So do I need to go to full screen, or is that already?
It's already, at full screen. It's
Okay.
already at full screen. Yeah.
Adam, did you want to share your screen? Is that what you're asking
No,
to do?
this is fine. We'll just go. We'll do this today. That's no problem at all. Yeah. So thanks again to the Native Learning Center for the opportunity to have this conversation today with my colleagues. I'm going to go ahead and let Keith, Rolando, and Jared all introduce themselves first, and then we'll just kind of dive into it from there. So Keith, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I am Keith Gregory. I'm the Director of Housing for the Pascua Yaqui tribe. I've been here for about 3.5 years. I've been in affordable housing kind of everywhere over the past, 16, 17 years. Pittsburgh, Chicago, Atlanta, Alaska, kind of everywhere. So happy to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the presentation.
Rolando, you want to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. My name is Rolando Jaimes. I am a member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe. I've also been in housing for about 18 years, all here in the Pascua Yaqui. And so I've had the luxury of seeing the department grow over all this time.
Great. Yep. Yeah. And so I guess just to start there, thank you both for joining the conversation today. I know I always look forward to hearing from you guys and your perspective on things, and uh, taking advantage of the opportunity to hear from you and learn lessons from you about the great work that all of you are doing. So thanks again for joining the conversation today. Our colleague Alexandria is not able to join, but Jared, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, hi, my name is Jared Jesse. I'm an architect with Travoy in the design department. And I've been working with Travoy for about 3 years now, with about 11, 12 years overall experience in architecture. And happy to say the PY7, which we'll be talking about, was one of my first projects with Travoy. And we've just kept the ball rolling.
Yep. And that's what we're going to really focus on and talk about today. So just a little bit more for the guests. I know that if you've joined any recent webinars, again, I want to just commend the Native Learning Center for their platform for making this type of content available. These are complex projects with lots of moving parts, but I think the Native Learning Center and their resources that they provide really enable participants with the opportunity to figure out, okay, we know we need to get something done. How do we take that next step to move forward? And I think that Keith and Rolando today are going to be great examples of, kind of taking the bull by the horns and saying, we're gonna do something. We're not gonna just talk about doing something. We're gonna get something done. Our work at Travoy really centers around two programs, helping tribes continue to access two programs. One being the low-income housing tax credit program. Just this past week, we did a little session through the Native Learning Center's platform specifically on that resource. We're not going to talk in detail about all the ins and outs of that today, but it is a very critical part of Pascua Yaqui's overall strategy and the projects that we're going to talk about. So it's kind of it's certainly part of the discussion today. The other resource that we help with is a resource called New Markets Tax Credits. So we've helped in that capacity on the number down at the bottom, helping raise about 118 million of equity investment into things like education facilities, cultural language schools, treatment facilities, healthcare facilities, broadband infrastructure, admin space. So that particular resource can be very ideal and help cover, offset maybe 20 to 30% of a project's cost for anything in the community development, economic development realm. We're not really going to focus on it too much today, but Pascua Yaqui is absolutely an entity demonstrating that full ability to use this kind of array of resources. They have both New Markets Tax Credits projects as well as the housing projects in the portfolio that we're going to talk about today. So with that, maybe Rolando, we can just start with you, and you can introduce everyone to the Pascua Yaqui tribe and where you're at, and then more specifically, we'll get into location in here in just a minute.
Sure, thank you. So the Pascua Yaqui tribe is in Tucson, Arizona. We're in the southwestern part of the city, just on the outskirts there, and so we're not necessarily rural, but we're on the southwest side of the city. As you can see on the screen here, our tribe is very small as far as the allocation of land. Our neighbors at Tohono O'odham have a lot of land there, but we're a little piece in that little orange or yellow little square that's highlighted. And so originally the tribe started with about 202 acres, and then they've acquired some other land around there. So that's become part of the reservation here in Tucson. But the reservation is kind of unique because we have tribal members that are spread out. We have some members in the Marana area, just north of Tucson. We have some in the Guadalupe area in Phoenix, next to Tempe and Chandler in that area. We have a few members that are located in the Scottsdale area. We have some in California and Fresno. And so the tribe is spread out, but the large majority do live here on the reservation on the southwest part of Tucson.
Yeah, and so where this project is located, Rolando, you want to elaborate a little bit more? You said the southwest side of Tucson. This is the reservation itself, but this particular piece of property kind of adjoins to its land acquired within the last few years where these concentrations of projects are happening. Is that right?
Yeah, so again, we're kind of landlocked between the city and also Tohono O'odham, and so our land base here is really limited, and so council years back decided to have us develop this 40-acre parcel that's highlighted here in orange. We went and hired an engineer. We designed this and got through that whole process of getting things lined up, designed, so that we can provide future housing. And so this particular area is the southern part of the reservation, and so that's what was designed. On the screen here now you can see the subdivision itself. So initially, way at the beginning, it was just thought, let's just do single family homes. So let's see how many lots we can fit in here. And through a series of rounds of community involvement, council, we came up with about 100 and something single family lots initially. So that's kind of where this is at in the screen.
Right. So maybe just to jump in there real quick. So one of the things that you said that I think is very important for all of the participants today is just how tight and how limited your land base there is. I mean, compared to Tohono O'odham, you're just a fraction of the size. So I think one of the things that I want to point out to the participants today that Pascua Yaqui has done extremely, extremely well is think about this resource of their land and how you're going to develop into the future that covers these few projects, but into the future as well. And I think that what you guys have demonstrated is this really forward thinking idea of, we know that there's going to be future development. We don't know exactly what that is going to look like on a project by project basis. But I think, Rolando, what housing really did well is you said, hey, let's plan for that now. And again, that was, 8, 10, 12 years ago. We know that growth is coming. How do we ensure that we have the infrastructure in place to prepare for that growth? How can we move from, project number 4 into 5 into 6, 7, 8, now 9, now future projects as well? So can you talk about a little bit, maybe just the thinking, again, 7, 8, 9 years ago when this kind of master plan concept was evolving and how you were thinking about how you would grow into that future growth?
So back in the day, council, there obviously there's always been a need for housing. So council says, here's this plot of land, go design it and get something prepared. So we went in with the mentality of single family homes. Let's see how many we can get in this area, with no idea of how we were going to fund construction, infrastructure, none of that. And so again, the ball started turning there, but it really kicked off. And again, this is more Keith's area, that he brought that creativeness and got us to where we're at right now. Because again, just mentality wise, back in that day, it was, let's just build single family residences, and let's see how many we can get, knowing that we have a huge waiting list. And reality is that this space is only going to limit how many houses we could get if that's the route we were taking. Yep. And so where it really kicked up a notch is once Keith got involved here.
Sure. And so Keith, I think maybe that's a great segue. So the plan has shifted a little bit, of course. I mean, that's not uncommon. But I think one of the things that became a very evident realization for all of you there was that there's this need across the spectrum, right? It's, young families, it's small units, it's maybe tribal elders, it's single families, young families that have kids. Maybe it's, young professionals that don't necessarily want a single family unit yet of their own. So Keith, I think that you've really kind of demonstrated what you've seen in other communities, that you really need that diverse mix of housing types across the board to be able to ensure that you're meeting all of the need as best as you can. Is that right?
Yeah. So just to rewind a second. So I just want to, give a little perspective. When I showed up, so Rolando's giving me a little more credit than I deserve. When I showed up, I think it was 2019 when I joined the tribe, and about 3 months in, I get presented with this. Hey, we need to develop this subdivision, and you have to understand, my initial proposal to Rolando was, hey, have you ever seen an ocelot? They're like little tiny like tigers, but they're tiny and they can't maul you and they're adorable. And I wanted to, have an ocelot sanctuary. And that was like my goal. That was my plan. That was what I wanted to do. And Rolando was like, no, we can't do that. So I was a little disappointed. But then we talked to council. We talked to the real story. Sorry. We talked to council. We talked to the community, and we said, what really needs to happen here. And what we came back with, was the feedback was really that we needed options, right? You of course we could have built all one type of housing, but really that wouldn't properly serve the community, because there are people at varying stages in their life, and they're going to go through varying stages of life. So when we really changed the plan from all single family to the 3 types of housing that we have, it was really a reflection of what we saw in our community, which was that there are families starting out that are smaller. Like you said, young professionals. There are elders who don't, maybe can't still take care of it. Like, some of these houses are 2 stories. Obviously, the older you get, the harder that becomes to maintain. And there are people who have their families, right? Or young families need the space, need the yard. So we really tried to build in diversity so that there was an option for everyone at each point throughout your life cycle, right? So at any point in time, we've got a unit here that should suit your needs at some level.
Yep. No, that's great. And then we're going to kind of drill into more specifically what these projects look like. But I think another thing that really strikes me is just the idea that you guys went into, that you kind of wanted to flip the model on its head of the traditional HUD housing that had been built. So for a number of years, Rolando, there had been sort of a single plan type, and everyone was kind of familiar with that and that housing type on the reservation. But I think, Keith, one of the things that you brought alongside Rolando is this idea that tribes deserve, modern amenities and great looking housing and good design just as much as everyone else. And that's true for, all communities that need affordable housing. Affordable housing doesn't necessarily have to mean bad design. And so I think one of the things that you did right off the bat is you said, the Pascua Yaqui people have a lot to be proud of. And one of the things that really strikes me, I had a recent conversation about sovereign immunity and what that means. And the conversation that we had was that a lot of tribes right now that are doing well, both meeting housing needs and economic development needs of their community, they're not using this notion of sovereign immunity as like a shield. It's more of using it as a sword and using it to further the objectives of the tribe. And I think that you can apply that to economic development, but you can also apply it to housing as well. So what else? What other thoughts do you have to that to kind of start this conversation just about your desire, Keith, to really kind of shake things up and do something that the people at Pascua Yaqui are really going to be proud of for the long term?
So, for me, and I think for the housing department as a whole, right, we look at the community and we say, okay, we can, of course, there's nothing wrong with the traditional housing model. I want to be open with it, right? But at the same time, I always struggled throughout my career in housing. When we would do new developments, you would look at the buildings that were being built and you would compare them to the non-affordable housing, so to speak, buildings that were being built. And there was always such a drastic difference in design quality. And I never understood why. An architect is still an architect, and an architect can design whatever you tell them to design. And so for me, it's always been, why would we give people anything less than the absolute best that we can afford to deliver for them? So that's really the approach we took. When we sat down with the design team, with Jared, and it was Jared and Adam Tiffy, we just said, look, we want something, we want to shake it up. We want something, we want the best of everything. And I think one of the things that doesn't happen enough, and for anybody who's on this call who is, working with architects or planning to work with architects, let them. So I was just saying this we're doing our 10th project and we're talking about something design wise. And says, architects don't get into the world of architecture to build boxes. They do it to build beautiful things that are going to last and be admired, because that's why anybody gets into any profession. You want to do something that is amazing. And I think architects are the same. So don't be afraid to just let the reins loose, let them go and let them design and let them come up with beautiful things for you. It's not like I sat down and drew these buildings. The design team came up with just awesome plans, but we had to tell them, go for it. Don't hold back. So that's the thing. It's really about, for us, and again, I can't speak for every community, but for us, we had a green light from council, and that's obviously you have to start there, right? But we had that green light, so we just ran with it and said, look, we're going to build the most amazing things that we can possibly build so that people have the pride of home. You pull up in that driveway and you look at your house and like, yeah, this is nice. That's what I want people to say when they come home.
Yeah, exactly. Jared, I think that's a great opportunity. I want to kind of bring you into this discussion as well. We've talked a lot about internally and, kind of across the board with our tribal partners that, good, affordable housing, quality, affordable housing, again, like doesn't have to be poorly designed. And to Keith's point, like there is no reason that, just because of the funding source or that the population living in units that's lower income, perhaps, like that they deserve anything less than, an asset in the community that everyone can be proud of. Right. So what is your thought as you kind of go into a design process just about, of course there's budget constraints and we have to fit the project into the funds that are available, but what are you thinking about for the benefit of low income tenants and what that means and how you start thinking about design for a particular project?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing we look at is what are the tribe's needs. So whether we're looking at a 1, 2, 3, 4 bedroom home, apartment units, that it kind of starts there. But realistically, I mean, the cheapest way to build is going to be 4 walls, 4 corners, a roof, 1 level. But you have to take it further from there. I mean, one of the things that we looked at for the Pascua, Yaqui, especially PY7 project, we have 40 acres to work with. Probably a quarter of that, a little bit more, is in a floodplain area where we can't build. So it's like, okay, how do we maximize these lots? How do we maximize what we're trying to use? So then we start looking into, second stories on the home. And, it really doesn't cost that much more to do something like that. And so it's really looking at, from a basis of design, what is the tribe looking for? If you want, for instance, PY7 is more of a modern style home. That was a request of the Housing Authority of Keith and Rolando, is that, we want something modern. We want something people are going to be happy to come home to, something that's clean looking. And so that's kind of where we started was, okay, clean, modern, desert style, where you still have to respect, where you're at. So we're in the desert. So we have to, it gets hot here in the summer and it gets cold at night in the winter. And, so you just kind of start there and you kind of, see what your restrictions are. And, good design does not have to cost more.
Yep.
It's just a matter of being thoughtful in your decision making. And so never be afraid to push your architect to say, hey, I really like craftsman style homes, go. Or I really like 2-story, or I want to incorporate this or that. It is their job to present you options and, make those options look good. That's what we do go to school for and, what our profession's about. So definitely do not be afraid to push them. And that's one thing that I can say Keith and Rolando continuously do is, they want to push the envelope on providing good design and affordable housing for their community. And they're not afraid to tell us, hey, go big. And then, from there we can scale back as needed. But I think that kind of gives and pushes the overall design.
Yep.
Jared, it's just because I want to be on the cover of Time magazine. It's like my personal.
I know it.
Adam, and I want to add, because I know we keep throwing traditional out there versus modern, but for the tribe, also the factor about being culturally sensitive. So traditional just means like we were used to building a house a certain way, which is basically a box, a rectangle. Yeah. And so that's what we mean by traditional versus like making it look nice now.
Exactly.
I didn't mean
like
want to look nice. We're not necessarily just skipping the cultural part. It's just that we don't want to settle for a box anymore.
Absolutely. That, the Pascua Yaqui people deserve better than that. And that, to have and preserve that tradition and that culture, you need to be able to have good quality housing as a starting point, right? So I think the other thing that you guys did, kind of right off the bat, and again, like this is all just a segue more specifically into these projects, is that you started thinking about, funding strategies, and you already had an idea of what could be a very viable path. And in this particular case, it was in the same line of what you had done previously. You had a track record of 6 previous tax credit projects using housing tax credits as a funding mechanism that continues to be very, very viable for tribes across the country because the level of subsidy and the level of benefit that it potentially provides. These projects are very demonstrative of our entire portfolio across those 200 plus tribal projects that we've played a small role in partnering in, that they provide a funding resource that can cover 70, 80, depending on the project type, 80% of the project's cost. So you kind of said, hey, like, we have this track record. We know that this has worked in the past. How do we continue leveraging that success and leveraging that expertise alongside the limited resources that you have there with your NAHASDA block grant? So that part of it was not really new. I think the only thing that was kind of a tweak on that was how these projects would ultimately look, but it was the same funding resource as had been used in the past. I think, like all successful developers, what Keith and Rolando have really done extremely well is think about all the potential resources that can be on the table and go into a conversation thinking about, okay, we know this is not going to be one funding source. We know in all likelihood it's not going to be just housing tax credits as a resource. How do we pursue affordable housing program grant through the Federal Home Loan Bank? Is there a strategic use of maybe a limited part of debt that we could get at really, really favorable terms to scale up the project or do something that maybe otherwise wouldn't be possible? Are there other resources out there that, maybe other tribal housing authorities might not even have on their radar, like the Capital Magnet Fund through the Treasury Department? Now, of course, there's this great resource out there of ARPA dollars, and I know that there's lots of tribes continuing to think about how do we take advantage of this little tiny bit of resource that is finally available for our community to move something forward and layer that alongside these other resources. So, Keith, this was really no different from your previous experience in Pittsburgh and in Chicago, but how did you kind of go in and assume that, there was going to have to be multiple sources on the table for this to work at this scale?
So, yeah, this is the fun part, right? So, we can talk about design and the cool stuff all day long, but this is where it kind of the rubber meets the road, right? It's how are you going to pay for this thing? And
Yep.
That's always a challenge, right? So for us, it was really just assessing every possible resource and doing that research, and that's the part that you have to commit to. So it's interesting because my career has primarily been in public housing, where there are certain resources that we don't have access to. Now, NAHASDA is a very different funding source than, say, the Public Housing Operating Fund or Section 8 fund. So when we really looked at our complete portfolio of funding, it became imperative to us to figure out how to pay for the things that the tax credits wouldn't pay for.
Yep.
You can use tax credits for about 80% of your funding. I won't say you can count on it, but it's generally speaking somewhere in that range that 70, 80% you can fund with tax credits. But you got to find the rest. And that's where you go for your NAHASDA funds, your Indian Housing Block Grant, your any reserves that you have, the grants that exist from the Capital Magnet Fund to AHP grants. So it was really a commitment on our end to really just research everything and look at every possible option.
Yep. So again, like, just backing up, you kind of stepped into this scenario again, thinking like, okay, tax credits, this is a path where we know there's a track record of tribes using it. There had already been a track record at Pascua, Yaqui, that this can be the primary resource. And if you start from that perspective, it sort of makes it a little easier then to start kind of chipping away at that remaining gap, right? So then, if 70% of your project is covered, which we're going to look at more closely here in just a minute, then it's like, okay, we can manageably do this. We could figure out how to get this smaller chunk funded, knowing this path that might be possible using housing tax credits as a resource to start. So for the participants on the call, again, this isn't intended to be an in-depth housing tax credits 101, but I do think that it's worthwhile to have a broad understanding of how this funding resource works. The first thing I want to point out is that this is a very well-established program. It goes all the way back to 1986 under the Reagan administration. And the whole intent of the program at that time was to minimize and to reduce the role of the federal government in doing housing directly, but create a mechanism to incentivize private investment into low-income affordable housing. So this resource is not specifically only for tribes. In fact, tribes have to compete against all the other developers in a given state for this federal credit. The other thing that happens is that this federal credit is administered at the state level. So while Pascua Yaqui is pursuing federal tax credits, it's administered by the Arizona Department of Housing in this particular case. So that process of how the credits actually are awarded into projects, that can vary pretty substantially from one state to the next, even though at the end of the day, it's a federal credit that's helping make this funding mechanism possible. Now, again, Pascua Yaqui, Keith and Rolando and the team there, people hear tax credits and they think, well, what good is that going to be to our organization? Maybe you're a nonprofit or a tribe. And that's exactly the case. Tribes don't have a need for the tax credits themselves. Affordable housing developers in general don't have a need for the housing tax credits. But there's now this system, this process where there are entities, investors, insurance companies, banks, they absolutely do have an appetite for these tax credits. So they're willing to put money into the project up front to basically cover a significant portion of the construction cost in exchange for this 10-year automatic stream of tax credits that flows to the project over a 10-year period. So I think the other thing that's important for people to understand is that you don't have to reapply for tax credits in a later year. We're going to start with an example here of project number 7 at Pascua Yaqui. Once they get an award of tax credits, in this case, that's $1 million. That's $1 million worth of credits that flows automatic to the project for 10 years, assuming that the project remains in compliance. So assuming that the project is renting to low-income families and that they're continuing to abide by the commitments that they commit to at the time of the original application. So this flow of tax credits is pretty much guaranteed. Assuming that the tribe continues to rent to low-income families, that resource is going to be there. They don't have to go back and reapply. So in super simple terms, what's happening here is the tribe is paying, requesting about $10 million worth of credits. In exchange, a tax credit partner is going to help offset the project cost by paying for that stream of credits up front. So just to elaborate on this just a little bit more, these federal tax credits, they're allocated on a per capita basis. So again, each state gets a big pot of housing tax credits. You'll see the acronym LIHTC, Low Income Housing Tax Credit. So each state agency, in this case, the Arizona Department of Housing, they come up with a plan or a rule book every year that defines what the competition will look like and how you have to actually compete for this allocation of tax credits. So in this case, Pascua Yaqui, they went in, as in the case of all their other projects, competing against all the other developers that are doing affordable housing across the state of Arizona. So what's really critical there is, number one, understanding what that rule book looks like. Number two, understanding that tribes, affordable housing developers, they have a very legitimate say in making and influencing change in that process. This is something that is updated annually, and very likely, this is a resource that there is significant opportunity for influence over what that process looks like. I know that the tribes across Arizona have been very, very influential, in part with our help, but in part because they're speaking up on their own behalf about this resource that needs to be available to tribal communities. And I think that has been, it's, kind of proven with where the path of housing tax credits has gone over the years, that there's now a set aside specifically for tribal projects in the state of Arizona. That same advocacy is true in several other states as well. California has a set aside for tribal projects. North Dakota and South Dakota both have something similar. Oregon has a set aside for tribal projects. And then above and beyond that, there's also the opportunity where tribes absolutely can compete for this resource. that portfolio of projects where we've played a small role, that 200 plus projects, demonstrates that yes, tribes can access this resource with the proper planning, with the ability to communicate with the state, with the ability to kind of use those tools to your advantage to make that change where it can benefit your project. Keith or Rolando, do you have any kind of big thoughts just on what you've seen there in Arizona and other states influencing this process, kind of in incremental steps, perhaps
Hey, Adam.
or a client's benefit?
Hey, Adam, Ms. Herbens, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, not to interrupt. And, I'll be happy for Keith and Rolando to respond. But we have 2 questions in the chat.
Yeah, sure.
Linda Brenner, she asks, what funding sources have you used to build affordable homes for those that make too much to qualify under low-income housing tax credit program?
Yeah.
That's the first question.
I think that's a great question. So I think the other caveat to this program, which, obviously Keith and Rolando can talk to more, is that 100% of the units in a given project will be at or below 60% area median income for the duration of the project. So you do have to go in and, Rolando, Keith, how do you guys think about affordability? These are lower income restrictions compared to NAHASDA. You're making commitments with deeper income targeting. How do you sort of start to weigh that in the context of this funding resource?
So for us, really, the question becomes, what is the best, what is the most need, and what is the best use of the funding? The tax credit funding allows us to address an area, a group of people who we really can't help other ways, right? There's not a lot of ways to provide housing resources for those with the very lowest income. So that's really, when we target this source, that's what we're targeting it for. When we think about, we do think more globally about affordable housing and housing in general, though most of the resources that come from HUD, that come from the state tax credit process, they're all low income, very low or very low income programs. To your question, Linda, as far as for people who don't qualify, who make too much to qualify for these programs, we're actually going to be launching, and this is kind of separate from this conversation, but we're going to be launching a workforce housing program here in the next this year, so in the next couple of months here, where we're out using the HUD 184 program to acquire housing, and then rent the housing back at affordable but market rates to those families that don't necessarily qualify for the low income program that we have through the tax credits.
Yep. No, I think that's exactly right. And so, Keith, I think another point for Linda's benefit also is that, again, I don't have an example specifically of what those income limits look like today, but across the board, whether you're in California or Washington or North Dakota, Maine, this same rule applies across the tax credit program, that if a family's income increases after they move in, they're not penalized and they don't have to move out of that unit.
Correct.
So in Keith's, project number 7 that we're going to look at, single family detached units, that's a really great strategy to be able, I say take advantage of, but it's perfectly permitted. You're not doing anything wrong, is to move in families that income qualify, fully expecting or anticipating, encouraging them for that matter, that they can improve their situation, they can get a better job, they can have another household, another income move into that household, and that household isn't penalized. They don't have to move out of that unit as long as they qualify initially. So as long as they qualify under the program requirements initially, after that, they're certainly allowed and permitted to stay in the unit. And I think for tribes that are trying to create affordable home ownership opportunities, that's a great provision to be able to take advantage of, because oftentimes, maybe it's a single parent family that's moving in to start with, or just a young family getting on their feet. Keith, Rolando, any thoughts to that? Like kind of how that fits in as far as your home ownership desire and the ability that ultimately, 15 years down the road, these units can convert to home ownership as well.
So, go ahead, Rolando. I see you unmuted.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say, because that is one of the things that council has wanted, for home ownership down the road. And so with this program, the way it was set up, it allows for that most of these tribal members, again, initially they might be lower income, but now that they have a steady place to live, something that's very nice for them, now that gives them stability, where if they go and get themselves some education or a better job, then they're making more money. And like you said, then they're already in a house, and now their longer term perspective is, now can I own this house? And so that mechanism will be there for them.
Yep, exactly. And so, Linda, I think getting back to your original question, this is still a really fundamental challenge, not only for tribes, but I think across the country, that there isn't really, there was some significant discussions as part of the Build Back Better legislation. Unfortunately, nothing moved out of Congress to create like a more middle income, say like that 80 to 120% area median income credit to benefit those types of families where you might have two decent jobs in a household, but they still can't afford anything in the market. I know, Washington is certainly representative of that type of scenario where, that population, there's not a lot of other resources out there. And that impacts everyone, not just tribes, but all communities across the country. So yeah, I think tune in to hear more from Keith in the future about their workforce housing program, as well as they continue to work on getting that off the ground. Again, I want to just go back to the fact that housing tax credits provides a very flexible mechanism to design to whatever your community needs, taking in cultural considerations, size of families on your waiting list, whether that's multifamily apartments or integrating in some type of community facility as part of your project, or single family units. I think the other thing that's really worth stressing that a lot of groups, sometimes overlook is that you can also rehab. You might have a couple hundred units in your current assisted stock. You can use housing tax credits to completely rehab those and restore those to new condition, without jeopardizing their status in the CAS. So I think this is very, very beneficial, and needs to be part of the toolbox in the right scenario, because a lot of those CAS units, let's say they were built in the early 80s or early 90s, they may not have had a big capital injection for a number of years. Tribes do a really phenomenal job of maintaining those units and keeping those units up to speed. But, as far as big capital improvements like all new cabinets and new kitchens and maybe adding on bedrooms and that type of thing, there just isn't a ton of resources to be able to do that. However, you can use housing tax credits as one of those mechanisms to, maybe put in $100,000, $125,000, $150,000 of investment, bring it totally back up to new condition. And I say that in part because hopefully that's also minimizing operating expense of those units for your housing department as well. So, if there's maybe you have overcrowded units and that there's not enough bedrooms, you can use this strategy to add on bedrooms, improve grading on the outside of the units. Maybe it's an upgrade to metal roofs or more fire retardant materials. Again, that can have a really big impact in the overall strategy. If, hey, we don't necessarily have a ton of need for new housing, but, we can make a big difference in the community with rehabbing units as well. So another thing to keep in mind. I think the other thing that I'm excited for Pascua Yaqui's future about is for them to take on a future adaptive reuse project as well. They haven't really done that yet, but I think that time will come where there's something like an old school or an old, maybe it's a hospital that can be reconverted. And the benefit there of that strategy is that resource is already connected in all likelihood to existing infrastructure. So the project in the upper right-hand corner at Socoggin, that was an old motel that the tribe converted from an old motel that had kind of outlived its useful life and converted it into 24 supportive housing units for veterans. So taking an asset that may already be in the community, maybe it's not even currently being used for housing, but repurposing that using housing tax credits to totally, flip that concept on its head to make good quality, affordable housing available. It can be very beneficial because, again, you may not necessarily have that huge infrastructure outlay that would otherwise be required. Keith, any adaptive reuse projects that you see on the radar or properties that you've been eyeing recently that could be housing there in Tucson?
So I bought a goat the other day, and I was really trying. I listen. I was gonna do it. I can't. It was too goofy. I was gonna run with that. I'm sorry. No, you know what? We are. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm so sorry. We um we are always kind of looking at opportunities. We're looking at. I know one of the things that is happening a lot in Arizona, also in California, is the organizations taking former vacant motels, hotels, turning them into different forms of affordable housing. That's something we're looking at. We're trying. We're big on breaking the mold. We're trying to do something new. We're looking at potentially, if we can acquire high-rise buildings in Phoenix. We're kind of all over the place. But yeah, so we want to do an adaptive reuse because in my experience, I've done them. You're right, Adam. They present certain benefits that you don't have to do certain things, right? The infrastructure is generally speaking already there. There are other expenses and other things you'll have to deal with, but it does create new opportunities. You can get yourself into places that you couldn't otherwise be in. Like, it's going to be hard for us to build new construction housing in Scottsdale. It's a very expensive place. But for a building that's dilapidated and run down, we can buy that and rehab it and save on those land costs. So there are definitely ways to leverage an existing property that are in some ways easier than trying to deal with new construction.
Yeah, and again, like I just encourage everyone to just keep options on the table, right? And like housing tax credits, it's one tool in the toolbox. It's not the solution for every single tribe out there, but it can be very beneficial when the time comes to apply it at the appropriate time. So, sometimes it could be a scenario like, okay, hey, we have this school and we think that we could do some like independent living units around that and maybe put in like 10 or 15 apartments in this old school with some new units around it. Again, another flexible opportunity that you could have to kind of think outside the box with maybe something that's already there in the community. So now we're going to really kind of get into the heart of what we're talking about and how Pascua Yaqui has just continued to run with this strategy. I see that there is a couple of questions, and one of them is how do we encourage families to keep up the property aesthetic? The first round of box housing have yards that are in need of TLC. I don't want to speak out of turn here, but I think one of my experiences, Ben, is that if you're giving families quality housing that from a design perspective looks nice as well, that means something to them. And it's no longer just a box to start with. And that, Keith and Rolando, what's your experience like? Has the response on the projects that you're working on, do families, when they have something that they can be proud of, does the dynamic change about how they view maintenance or keeping up their property?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. It goes without saying, like, in my just life, personal life, right? Every time that I've moved someplace that was nicer, I don't want to be the neighbor that doesn't take care of the nice stuff, who brings down the neighborhood. Like, nobody wants to be that person. So our hope, obviously, is that people get this opportunity to live in this very modern, very high-end design, well-designed development. They'll naturally want to keep it up. Also, because it's home ownership, it's an opportunity to own it, and it can be yours. You don't want to let that fall apart either. I will say that we are going to create some community standards, and that's not something that we have historically done, but we're going in that direction just across the board, where we have community standards and we have certain things that we're going to expect our tenants to do as kind of like their part of being in our units. Because at the end of the day, we are still, no matter whether it's the stuff that we're talking about, our older projects or whatever comes later, we're still trying to create homeowners. And at the end of the day, part of that is really understanding what it really means to live in a community and be a part of a community and be a good member and a good neighbor, in that community. So, we're creating a set of community standards that we hope will help to kind of just guide people. They're not punitive. We just want to guide people in the right direction as to really what it means to really be a good neighbor in these communities.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So
And
there's another question. Go ahead.
Oh, and I just want to add briefly to that too, is that I mean, it's all like a mentality as well. And so sometimes in the past, those yards weren't thought of. They were just like an after effect of let's build this house, and we need to do something with the front yard. But now it's been part of the thought process as well. And so, yeah, the idea is that if we can help the community members change the way they see their house, then they will take more, pride in it, and just be more, take care of it themselves. And so that's part of the hope as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the other thing that the strategy that you guys have used kind of allows for is that you're sort of recognizing up front that, hey, there is some more investment that is going into these projects. But when you're able to use higher quality materials that aren't going to deteriorate as fast, they're going to hold up better. Those all go towards that ongoing maintenance cost and expense as well. So if you can invest a little bit more up front to be able to minimize those operating costs, then I think that another outcome is that you get units that hold up better too. And again, like that's a benefit to the community overall. Keith, any thoughts to that, or maybe Jared from a design perspective?
I was waiting on Jared. No, so yeah, I think again, just what you create says a lot about what you expect. I think, when we start thinking very intentionally about what we're building, I think people see that and recognize that and want to, also sort of be a part of it, right? Nobody wants to look back 50 years from now and say, yeah, I remember when this place was beautiful. They want to be like, this place is still beautiful.
Yeah.
Some communities have that ability on their own to stay well designed and well managed and well manicured and well kept. And it's not because every single person that moved in was great. It's just because that became the nature of the community. It's why you wanted to live in that community. So people become a part of the solution on their own. And that's really what we want. We want to do this. We designed it such, and we've built it such, and we've really focused on quality in a way that hopefully kind of naturally builds that within the people that move in. If they're like, you know what, the tribe went all out to build this for us, so we're going to go all out to keep it good, because one day it's going to be ours.
Yeah.
And so it's really, our intent hopefully creates their intent, and it all just kind of works together in the long run.
Yep. No, I appreciate that. So another question that we have here in the chat is about the tribe being a certified public health program. I'll be honest, I don't know exactly what that is, but the question is, were you able to bring in any funding based on that unique status? Not for this particular project, but I do think it's worth noting that this particular funding resource, it can really be a kind of healthcare mechanism as well. So let's say you're a community and you have a treatment facility, but you're thinking about, well, what happens when these tenants move when they're done with treatment? Where are they going to go after that? So maybe you're a health department and you're saying, hey, like, we have a housing need from a health perspective. And if we could layer on some comprehensive, like, supportive services, or, maybe those are already being delivered by the tribe, but there's not like a dedicated place where individuals can go to receive those services. You can use this funding mechanism to do exactly that. So, again, like, housing cuts across so many different areas and departments. Keith and Rolando, I know, are really focusing on homes for families and large family units, but we recognize that some communities also say, like, oh, our health department, they have a need for this as well. So there's no reason that this same particular strategy couldn't be used in like a supportive housing / kind of wraparound services context, if that's what your community needs. Is that anything that's on your radar, Keith or Rolando, as far as more comprehensive supportive service housing?
Every time I wait, nobody says anything. Yeah, I mean, the risk, I guess, to being us is that once you do something like we've done with these 3 projects that we're talking about, 7, 8, and 9, all of a sudden the expectations change, right? And people are like, hey, seriously, you can do anything, so why aren't we doing everything? So that puts my goat sanctuary and my ocelot sanctuary right back on the table. But also, yeah, I mean, we're always in conversations with the tribal council and other departments about what can be done, what's possible. I mean, we're in a space now where we're talking about the workforce housing thing again, and We're talking about just developing as, you know, using development as a means to create revenue for the tribe. We're out looking at, you know, how can we partner with the health department? How can we partner with social services, education, you know, potentially doing like a Yaqui high school or some of these other things that just become part of on the table. You know, it's an open, once you do, I'll be honest with anybody on here, once you do one of these projects and you do it well, all of a sudden you don't have to, you will stop having to think about new ideas because everybody will come to you with the, you know, ideas about what could happen or could we do this. And it's such an amazing feeling to know that you've done something that has impacted people in a way that makes them want to give you new ideas. And, you know, so yeah, I mean, we're looking at everything. That's probably the best way to answer that question.
Yep. Appreciate that. So real quick, kind of diving into this project. This is project number 7. So we looked at that site plan before. It was already laid out for mostly single family homes. So that continued on this path for sure. And you guys kind of went in and said, hey, we helped do an evaluation of how many tax credits the project could realistically be competitive for. And I think that the team there said like, hey, let's get as many as we possibly can and take advantage of those economies of scale. You know, typically a tax credit project it could be in the 25 home range, but you guys, you knew the demand was sufficient and you knew that you could easily fill 50 units and this funding resource was going to be there to do that. So you said, let's go as big as we can. Let's try to get as many units as we can. And that's really interesting because if we look at the timing over here, construction of this particular project started in January 2021. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute, that timeline piece. But this was a project that cost about $20 million total. This particular project, your bids came back at about 17.8 with the infrastructure and the vertical construction included. But what we see here is that the housing tax credit resource helped pay for about 15.6 million of that right off the top. So then what Pascua Yaqui did is they said, okay, we're going to go after, you were able to get another $1 million grant through the Federal Home Loan Bank. So on this $20 million project, on project number 7, only about $3 million was the contribution that came from the tribe to make this project possible. So about 85%, again, that number that Keith referenced before, very plausibly paid for by this resource using housing tax credits. Now, before we get into some of the really awesome design elements, Keith, there was something that happened in the past 2.5, 3 years, right? Like a global pandemic. Is that right? I vaguely remember.
Like that. You know, people were not coming to work and I don't know what it was.
Yeah. So this project and then the next one is certainly a good example of how those costs pretty drastically changed over that 2-year period and then continue to impact projects to this day. So before we get into the next one, I just say that because, you know, there's some different unique construction cost dynamics pre-COVID that then became applicable in this progression as well. So Jared, you know, Pascua Yaqui came, Keith and Rolando said, hey, we want to do something. We're thinking about home ownership units. You mentioned some of the design elements before, but what else can you talk about as far as elements of this design now that these units are about 90% complete that really kind of jump out to you?
Yeah, I think, you know, if we had some overall pictures, it'd be a little bit better. But, you know, one of the things that we kind of focused on, again, is, you know, how does this fit within a community space? What is this going to look like in the desert environment? So when you actually get out there and you take a look at the full development from like the south side or one of the edges, you really see this relation to the hills and the mountains kind of off in the distance. So automatically the housing style, even though it's very modern, we're using local materials. You know, it's a lot of stucco, it's a lot of natural stone. Even the LP lot siding that we're using is they have a local manufacturer in Phoenix. So we're using a lot of natural materials for the area. We're just doing it in a very modern style. So that's something to really focus on here is, you know, wherever you're from, you know, there are local materials that you guys will want to use and pull from, and you can do that in a traditional style, either, you know, we could have used these on a craftsman style home, or we could have used these on, a HUD style, just a 4-wall basic style type home. But with introducing the modern style, but still keeping it very desert modern, and that's kind of where a lot of these materials emerge from. And it's also going to speak towards the quality and longevity of the projects, because we are using stucco and natural stone. These are materials that are going to hold up well over time as well. So kind of going back to that question, as far as, how do you keep up, how do the tenants kind of keep up with the homes, is one, even though these are modern, they're clean looking, we're using very familiar products, very local products that are going to be maintainable very easily over time. So we're not using some, Norwegian marble on countertops or something like that. We're using very local
That was an
materials.
option? Wait a minute, that was an option? Sorry, go ahead.
There's a reason why I don't tell you certain things, Keith. No.
So there is a question in the chat about just differentiating this term of like workforce housing. I think that's a good point, because I guess what I see as workforce housing is like, there's lots of families that are working 2 jobs. They're doing the absolute best that they can, but there really isn't good quality housing available at their particular price point. So I think that there's that type of housing, kind of middle income housing, that kind of overlaps in some ways with workforce housing. But I think that when we talk about workforce housing, it can also be something like this, where, again, like, we fully anticipate that families are going to continue to grow into these units. Maybe they continue to get a better job. So it's, how do you get families into a housing opportunity and enable them to continue to grow and to continue to grow their families? So again, like, I think housing tax credits is a strategy for workforce housing, but what you have to sort of understand is that it's going to be 60% AMI households or below. And then, so if you're talking about something above that, then you're kind of talking about like middle income housing, which we kind of have to strategize different about how that works and what the funding source could be. The other question that is in the chat is the types of rent levels that are being charged on this particular project. So I'm going to go back to this one here, because I think this is important. The question also talks about like the loan on the project. And actually, this is not a loan. This was the contribution from the tribe that they knew going in was going to be their ultimate contribution. So it goes into the project essentially as a soft contribution. It's technically loaned to the project, but it's understood that this is effectively their contribution. So they're using that mechanism to be able to leverage these other funding resources of housing tax credits, and in this case, affordable housing program grant. But that mechanism of using NAHASDA, Keith and Rolando, that enables you to continue using the same tax credit rent policy as your other units, right? So it's 30% of adjusted income. Is that right?
Yes. So nothing about our approach to rent collection or rent rates changes. It really keeps everything easy for us to manage. We're not doing anything that we wouldn't already be doing for these, for operations on these units. So it's really kind of seamless. And I think for a lot of us, I will tell you, possibly we have, our housing department is fairly large, all things considered. Like, I have like 60 employees. So we're a big housing department. And I know some of you might not have those kinds of resources operationally, but when you have a program that can bring you this much money and give you this much opportunity, and it doesn't really change your operation any, then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, I can do this, because the keeping it in compliance side is very important. But if it doesn't really change your operation anyway, then it's easy for you to take this on and not be really concerned about whether or not you can handle it.
Yeah, and I think another point to that is that that's something that you guys have done by choice. Another approach is that we've had a lot of clients that say, hey, we are going to adopt and implement a little bit different rent structure for our housing tax credit units. And a lot of that goes to the fact that, tribes, they're not getting additional NAHASDA funds. So they build new units. You guys have to continue to subsidize those units. your block grant isn't necessarily changing because you've added new units into the stock. So as tribes continue to develop and build for their communities, we think it's important that you think about the financial sustainability of these projects as well. So I think that there's a very healthy balance between, very, very, very low rents, artificially low rents, maybe it's $50 a month that you're charging, and those high market rents, which, maybe it's $1,200 in your particular market. There's got to be a balance somewhere in between where tenants are still getting a good, affordable rent for good quality housing. But you as an organization, you also have to have the ability to collect rents to offset the operating cost, because Pascua Yaqui is no different in that regard. They're not getting additional NAHASDA subsidy on the back end of these units. So they have to really think about, how do we maximize and how do we ensure that we're charging enough rent to have operational stability for the long term. Keith, anything that you're thinking about there that could be helpful for the participants?
So that's like the $2 million. I mean, if I can solve this question, I could take over, but no. It really comes back to your own tribal resources. For us, we are focused on housing people. We are focused on trying to make homes affordable. We are focused on really doing these projects in a way that is supportive of the community at this point in time, right? But when it comes to trying to figure out operationally what kind of structure are we going to use to pay for things and rent collection, and what processes we're going to use, my encouragement to everybody is to really assess your own community and your own needs and your own resources. For us, we're at a place where we can with the NAHASDA money that we get, we're able to basically use our staff to kind of operate these things without really having to take on too much more. I mean, we add a couple more people and I can handle. I mean, I had 5 people that can probably handle another 100 houses, right? So it really becomes a question of what you want your operation to feel like, and what your community standards are for affordable housing. Like some communities are more strict about, the expectation is that the rent is this and you're going to pay it and it is what it is. Other communities are like, what, we are going to make this as affordable as possible. So I would just really assess your own needs and resources and figure out what is best for you. And kind of when you started that and we were talking about tribal sovereignty, I think that's really what it is, right? It's taking this as this resource, but determining for yourself what makes the most sense for you.
Yeah, and I think the flip side is that, there is certainly no problem, and it's perfectly allowable to, let's say it's an elder project, and you say, hey, like, our elders, we want to support them. We want to offer very low rents as a means of supporting them. But tribes then just have to understand, like, do that work at the front end to understand what the implications are going to be on the back end, on the operating side, so that, when it comes time to pay the operating expenses and pay the insurance expenses, that $50 a month may not be sufficient to cover that full operating cost. So what is the plan then on the back end? Housing tax credits, it's really a development program. It's not providing any additional operating subsidies. So if that's the path that you're going to choose, that's perfectly appropriate and that's perfectly fine. We just want to encourage groups to make sure that you're looking at the whole picture of what the implications are on the back end of that project as well. There's another question about, would you be able to put some type of greenhouse type devices on the flat rooftop? And greenhouse, I'm not sure exactly what that term means, but Jared, do you want to just talk about like solar design and like energy efficiency items that are part of these units?
Yeah, so for both PY7 and 8, these two projects were designed for a HERS rating of 65 or better. So if a standard house performs at a 100% rating, and ours perform at a 65, then we are 35% better on energy performance than a normal house. And that's kind of, if you're not familiar with the HERS rating, other projects, your housing authority might decide to go with, LEED, or there's a lot of other different energy resources out there to kind of make sure that the homes are being designed well for performance value. And that's something that the Arizona Department of Housing required at the time was a 65 or better rating. Actually, I think it was like 75 or better rating. And we came in somewhere around 60 to 65. So all of these are designed very energy efficiently. When it comes to greenhouse, I don't know if you're referring to an actual greenhouse, like, if you're trying to, have plants and make sure plants can grow, that sort of thing. I mean, anything can be put on a flat roof for the most part. The roof just has to be designed for the overall load on the roof. So whether you are referring to a greenhouse itself and being able to put plants up there versus being able to do solar, really you just need to work with, make sure your architect knows what you're wanting. All of these houses are designed for future solar. So all of them have conduit running through or piping running through for future conduit for solar. And those are all designated in one area of the home. And then all of the roofs have been designed to hold solar panels in the future as well, and for future solar panel installation, mainly on the angled roofs, but we could potentially do them on the flat roofs as well. But typically don't like to do that just because of the type of roofing. It's TPO roofing. So yeah, I mean, just depending on what your state requires, like California requires solar panels from the get-go. So that's something that can definitely be included. PY, like I said, PY 7 and 8 are both designed for future solar once those can be put in. That's kind of been a side project, I believe, of Keith and Rolando's, is at a future date, the idea is the whole 40 acre site will be solar or have some sort of solar power for all the buildings. And then PY9, once we get to it, that was included as an alternate with the base being pre-wired for solar. So that's something that all of these buildings in themselves, it really doesn't, as far as wiring for future, structurally, it's not going to change a whole lot. The loads for solar panels aren't that much. So if you think you want it in the future, it's something that the structural engineer can account for that limited load, and something that the home can just be ready for in the future.
Yep. No, that's great. Thanks for that, Jared. Go ahead.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so we definitely are energy conscious, because again, we're talking about families that have limited resources. So as part of that design, we're trying to give them as much help as we can to lower their bills, and trying to balance that with construction costs and all these other things. And so yeah, like Jared was explaining, we definitely are trying to prepare for the future. And so by doing some of these pre-wirings and things like that, if an opportunity comes up down the road, then we're going to be able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, and we're not going to spend a ton of time on this today, but again, like my regards to the Native Learning Center for their clean energy conference, renewable energy conference that they just hosted there at their facility. Lots of great discussion there about resources through the bipartisan infrastructure law, where that very viably could be a source for Pascua Yaqui in the short term to basically convert 100% of these units that are now being built to solar kind of in the short term. And so if you're a community where maybe you already have homes, certainly happy to talk more about that too, and the resources that might be available through that totally separate new funding resource that we're not even really talking about today. I think there's a question about whether or not these could be a strategy for elder housing and to support them culturally, traditionally, and medically instead of placing them in state-funded nursing facilities. Yeah, so where the distinction lies is that this is absolutely can be for elder housing, for independent housing. You can even have age-restricted 55 and older housing. Where the line kind of is that if it's full-blown assisted living, like a licensed medical facility, you cannot use housing tax credits in that capacity. So there's a couple conditions that have to be met for low-income rental housing. It does have to be a minimum 6-month lease term. And it's not intended for kind of the full-blown assisted living licensed medical facility. Now, we've had a number of clients, tribal clients, that have used the new markets tax credit resource for that very type of project once you get into assisted living. But what we're talking about here is like you can absolutely have like common area, community space, maybe it's a gathering space that's incorporated into your project. I'm going to go ahead and we'll go to project number 9 right away just to show you what that kind of looks like. So any project, go ahead.
Yeah, let me interrupt you too. It's just so that we can give a perspective. One of our projects was elderly housing. It's like you said, it's not like the full nursing type, but it's a campus style where we built a 5-plex. They had 2 bedrooms, 1 bedroom. And so if there is a caregiver, somebody can live there, but it's not, like you said, it's not geared for a facility, a nursing facility. But we were able to use these tax credits to help house our elders in this one community area that we have here on the reservation.
Yep. And so you could do a specific elder project just as Pascua Yaqui has done. Maybe it's a totally different design. Maybe it's a multifamily building with separate exterior entrances with a hallway down the middle or something. Again, a lot of flexibility. It kind of starts with what your community needs and what the population is that you're trying to serve. So this kind of leads into the latest project. Again, kind of keeping in mind that we went from single family homes to townhomes, throwing a pandemic on there that really kind of took up construction cost, but tax credits continue to be a very viable source to pay for project number 8. That kind of led right into project number 9. And so, Keith, you said it before that you continue to see and hear from tribal membership there that there's a need for units across the board, right? Not only large family units, but 1 and 2 bedroom units, smaller 3 bedroom units as well. And you're also trying to think about how do we maximize this land base? How do we get as many units and serve as many of the population that we can at the time? So that's sort of the pretext for how you kind of decided, like, we want to think about something a little bit more dense in this project number 9 scenario, right?
Yeah. So, for us, we're always trying to get the biggest bang for our buck and for the space that we have. So as Rolando mentioned, when we very first started this presentation, we have a very, very small reservation footprint compared to a lot of other tribes, especially in the area. And so because of that, we are forced to think differently about how we utilize that land. And, in areas, you think of cities that have smaller footprints but large populations like San Francisco, Chicago, New York, they go up. And so we kind of look the same thing. So, we want to go up. Also, because we are just a wildly competitive bunch, we wanted to prove to everyone that we could do better than anything else that was, in the region. So if you come to Tucson and you're looking at all of the apartment style living in the entire cities, particularly the affordable housing, but really anywhere, you're not going to see a lot of projects that are as pretty as ours. There are some, certainly, but in the affordable housing space, we wanted to just be the best that we could possibly be and to really showcase just everything that we were capable of. Because again, I would encourage tribes to just remember, every time you do a project, you're doing it for your community, yes, but you're also doing it for everybody else in this space too. So when you start doing things, and when we start doing things that break molds and are bigger and better and more creative than what's happening outside of tribal housing, it's just a reminder to everybody else that, we're just as good as this as you are, if not better. And so we're trying to make these statements, not just for ourselves, but just overall, so that people take the tribal housing industry more seriously. But also, so we wanted an awesome product, and we got an awesome product.
Well, yeah, and I think that there's a lot to that, this is tribal housing. This is tribal housing today in 2023, right? This, I think, goes and is reflective of all of that tremendous work across the country that tribes are doing every single day. I know that a lot of times it comes with a lot of challenges. It comes with headaches. All of these projects take work to get off the ground, but tribes day in and day out do this work for their tribal members. And Pascua Yaqui is certainly reflective of that. But to your point, Keith, like, that is not to take away from anything else that tribes are doing. Tribes continue to do great work. And I think that what we love highlighting is just what that means, what tribal housing means today compared to, say, 50, 60, 70 years ago. So, Jared, we have this multifamily project, still a lot denser than a lot of our other tribal projects. And that's fine. Again, like Pascua Yaqui is just trying to think about like what the need is in their community. So this might not be the need for all groups, but what were you thinking about as you started to kind of get into a more dense design concept?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the important things to think about that we were looking at is how is this building going to relate to the rest of the site? Adam, can you go back to that last site plan that you had open?
Yep.
A couple slides back.
Yep.
A lot of slides back.
Yep.
Here we go. One more up. So you can kind of see where, phase 1 in orange, phase 2, which are the townhomes in gray, and now this phase 3 project. So in order to even get to phase 3, we're really driving through the other 2 phases, and we really still want to give that sense of community space or community for the overall 40 acres. So it's really how do we relate back to the housing that's already been done, this design style that we use, the amenities that the tribe is looking to provide for their citizens, and really how does that relate to this new building. So that's kind of where we first started with this, and kind of looked at, where to place this on the site with what we had left over that wasn't already used. The other thing that you really can't see on here is there is a 100-year floodplain that we can't build inside of due to Arizona Department of Housing. It's one of the, actually it's on the federal side. You can't build within 100 and unless you do you move it essentially. So it was something else that we had to take into consideration. This back corner really fit really nicely. We did look at, and I think you have an image of it in the future of some commercial space as well, but we really thought about, maximizing how many units we could do again. So we looked at 50 units. We really had to pay attention to how high we could go. So what kind of fire protection does the tribe currently have? So can their fire department handle a 5-story building, a 10-story building? What is finance going to allow? And so you start looking at, the overall design, you start looking at, what the tribe's qualities are and, what the restrictions are. And that's where we kind of pare down, how many overall units we're going to have. And then it's, how many, what type of amenities does the tribe want to provide, in an apartment building? And that's a big one to think about, because apartments are definitely different than single family homes or even townhomes. And it's something that, if you look at market rate housing, amenities have gone through the roof. I'm talking pools, dog runs. I mean, the amount of amenities and game rooms and things that are out there right now for market rate, what do you want to provide for, your tribal members at, the low income housing tax credit rate? And that's something that really the tribe decided to do, a rooftop terrace, which is something that we can add on to with really minimal expense because the space is already going to be there, a fitness center to promote health and well-being for the community, and just some lounge space, communal spaces that people can get together. So these are not, extraordinary amenities to be providing for an apartment building, especially a 50-unit apartment building. These are things that are going to help bring the community together, again, to help promote, everybody who's living there to be neighbors and to take care of each other, take care of the building. So these are all amenities that, kind of work within that overall scope that PY is trying to provide. And that's kind of where, we then start looking at, this, where the building goes. Yep. And I think we did, we kind of stuck with sort of this modern desert aesthetic, using the same sort of materials we're using for the residential units for the single family and the townhomes, introducing some new materials like metal panel that aren't necessarily outrageous costs. The metal panel, comes in at $3 to $4 a square foot, which is definitely a little bit more compared to like stucco, but for a commercial style building is really on the cheaper end. And so kind of keeping some of these things in mind as we move forward. And then also this really thinking about this courtyard space in the front and how that can potentially be utilized for families and for the community space as well, not only for potentially this apartment building, but for the rest of the development.
Yep.
A big,
Yep. No, that's great. So there was one more question about were there any, I guess this is a question for Keith or Rolando, were there any pushback or did you get any pushback about too dense a housing from tribal council at all? Or what was the response when you kind of presented this denser housing concept idea?
Go ahead, Rolando.
Well, I was just going to say, from a tribal member perspective, this is something that's totally different than what's been here on the reservation. Again, it's always been single family detached homes. And so yeah, there might be a little bit of a stigma with when you hear an apartment building, but once they see what we've created here, I think that goes away, because everybody, I think, has a picture in their mind of what an apartment building is, according to like what they've seen in movies from bigger cities, those kind of things. But again, one of the intentions of doing this was definitely to make it look where you want to live there, not that you're thinking this is an apartment building. So
Right.
so a lot of that has gone away because of that design. I'm sure Keith has probably heard from other people other things as well.
No,
Yeah.
I think, when we talk about the design of the apartment complex, it's, I think, to Rolando's point, it's a scary thing to say to people, because it's affordable housing and people naturally associate high-rise affordable housing with Cabrini Green in Chicago and all these other, Robert Taylor homes, all these other kind of, Queensbridge in New York, these huge public housing project kind of things from like the 60s and 70s, and they were awful, and that's what people associate with that. What we're not building those. These aren't 600 unit apartments. So like Rolando said, when people see the design and when we really talk through what it is that we're creating here, for the most part, those concerns go away. The same thing happened though when we talked about a new design for Project 7 and 8. There was kind of an immediate kind of like knee-jerk reaction, like, whoa, what are you doing? It's different. But once people really saw the care that we took going into it and the intent that we had, people came around and said, oh, I get it now. Once they could see the houses, they're like, oh, this is awesome. And now, I get a call a day, basically. Somebody wants to know how they can get in to the new units. And I expect that we will have the same, response once the apartments start going up and they start seeing the balconies and the colors and realize that it's not the projects as we so commonly refer to them, but it's actually no different than, in Tucson, there's a building called the Flynn right downtown. Our building looks just as good and is just as nice as that one.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the association will get to over time.
Yeah. And Keith, to your point, like Cabrini Green, no one would have said like, this is good quality design. Like this is somebody really put a lot of thought and effort into the respect and dignity that these tenants deserve.
Right.
That was not the case. And I think the outcome is sort of reflective of that.
Yeah.
But here it's totally different, where you're saying, hey, our families deserve the same thing as the market rate families everywhere else. And just because of their income doesn't mean that they're any less deserving of good design.
Yeah,
So
no, absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, that's absolutely true. And I know there's a question here about like the kind of piggybacking on about the critics about multi-story, but how do you respond when somebody's telling you it's too expensive? And I think so. And to be fair, so I don't want to encourage anybody to do anything that puts their career at risk. I'm the kind of person who has absolutely no regard for my own well-being. So I just say kind of whatever comes to my mind, as you probably figured out by now. When we would get those questions about cost and what's too expensive, I always like to remind people, what's the cost of not housing people? What's the cost of not building this project? What's the 20, 50, 100-year cost of not doing anything or doing the same thing? So when you're really, when you get in those conversations, because you will have to have, especially if this is your first time or you're trying to do something different, you're going to have to explain it and justify why we're doing this. But I always like to kind of put that back as, what happens if we don't do this? What happens if we continue to do the same thing? Yeah. Usually that kind of answers its own question and it solves itself. Nobody wants to be seen as a hurdle to progress. So it's really trying to convince people that this is about progress and the future and nothing more than that.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's all the time that we have today. So again, I want to thank Keith and Rolando and Jared for your amazing input and your amazing work on this project, pushing your community forward at Pascua Yaqui. Again, I want to thank the Native Learning Center, and I'm going to turn it over to Hervins and Awista for them to wrap up as well.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much. And a special thank you as well to your colleagues for a wonderful presentation. Very, very informative. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let me go ahead and open back up the presentation. Yes, so thank you so much again for all of those wonderful details and information. I'd like to extend a special thank you again to Gerard, Keith, as well as Rolando. Thank you very much. Right now, I'd like to remind everyone, I stated it earlier in the webinar, but once again, if you could be so kind as to complete the post-webinar survey, which helps us improve our services here at the Native Learning Center for Indian Country and help us improve future webinars and trainings that take place as well. So our next webinar is scheduled for Tuesday, March 21st. And this is e-commerce for beginners. And it's presented by the Indian Dispute Resolution Services, IDRS. And it will be scheduled at the same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Central, 12 p.m. Mountain Time, as well as 11 a.m. Pacific Time. Registration, as always, is free. I'd also like to let you all know that this webinar has been recorded and will be available via our website, www.nativelearningcenter.com. You can find, past webinars as well on our website. I'd encourage you all to keep up with us on our social media to keep up with all of the happenings here at the Native Learning Center. Also check out our podcast, Hopatenga Podcast. It is distributed on multiple different platforms, and you can also check us out on YouTube. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Once again, my name is Hervins Bonestein. I'm the Training and Development Manager here at the Native Learning Center. I'm here joined with my training coordinator, Awista Atkins. And on behalf of the Native Learning Center, thank you again for joining us. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.